and she leads Cadence RoundTable's policy work. She has extensive parliamentary, Whitehall and local government experience. She also, which I thought was really interesting, when I first started learning about you, Rebecca, is a trained nurse with more than 5 years of experience supporting and training NHS staff in how to lead on sustainability. And also, before she got involved in policy, Rebecca spent time as a community worker in London, and she's also lived off-grid in southern Spain and Dorset. I don't know if there's anywhere else, Rebecca, but and she's also got an interest in the experience of low-income communities and families and individuals, in particular during and after severe weather events. Now, the context for this session is that myself and Kim have both been along to some of Cadence's sessions, and I've always been really, really impressed by the quality of insight and knowledge that they have so readily shared. And we both went along to this particular one, this food security session, and were just really struck by, well, obviously it's just very, very important, and Rebecca has done a huge amount of research and information gathering and insight that she has so generously agreed to share with us. So there, she's rerunning a session that's already run for Cadence RoundTable and agreed to run it for us as Heart. So, I first of all just want to say thank you very much for doing this. We really, really appreciate, first of all the hard work that you put into putting this together, and also the fact that you're doing it for us and for our peeps and our communities. So thank you very much. Before I hand over to Rebecca, I just want to give you a context for how the session's going to run. Rebecca's going to present some very important and useful and insightful data and insights and implications about food security. That'll be 25 minutes or half an hour. Then there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions that are burning questions for you. And then depending on how that conversation develops, we may then move into smaller groups so that we can have further conversations about our reflections, our insights, our thoughts about what we've heard. And then we'll come back together for a nice comprehensive Q&A and conversation together before we leave and finish at 9 o'clock. So we've got an hour and a half, just under an hour and a half now. So that's how it's going to run. We would ask that there's no interruptions while Rebecca's doing her initial presentation. Obviously, if you can't hear or something like that, then just put something in the chat box. But there will be ample time for questions. Can everyone just make sure they're muted throughout the whole presentation, please, because we're going to be recording this, and we'll be able to share that with you afterwards. Anything else that I need to say? I don't think so. Okay, I'm going to keep admitting people and trying to mute them. All right, so I'm gonna hand over to Rebecca now. Right, okay, great. Rebecca, over to you.
Cheers, Chantal. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. I feel like moving to Hertfordshire. It's obviously an incredible amount of interest and serious focus on some of the important issues coming up. So it's really nice to see you all. Can everybody hear me okay? And if you can't, could you speak now? Okay. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to share some slides with you, and it's quite a lot of material and it's not settling stuff. It's a little bit unsettling. So it's really good that we've got time to chat afterwards. What I would like to do is share the sources with you at the end, and it may be that Chantal will send those out with the recording. Just that there's a few very, very important reports that it's worth you looking at if you want to investigate this.
Oops, sorry. Oops. Can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Right, let's get a slideshow going. Okay, I'm going to move through this material quickly. I speak very quickly, so I'm going to make a concerted effort to slow right down so that everyone can follow what I'm on about. Okay, so this session, I should say a little bit more about myself, just so that people are clear. I'm not a food policy person. I work, when the policy work that I've done has been very specifically on climate change and social policy, which has included food. But when we were looking at this at Cadence, we really struggled to find somebody who was going to be able to reflect the picture for us. And so I decided to do a deep dive because I'd been wanting to look at it for a while. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and reflections, especially if there's somebody here who works in food routinely. It would be really good to hear your thoughts when we get a chance to open it up. Okay, so the structure for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about multiple breadbasket failure, but I will move between multiple breadbasket failure and food security to anchor the subject. I'm going to talk a little bit about drivers, risks and multipliers being particularly important. And I think that's probably why there's such a good turnout today, because this is becoming a live issue already. I'll do a very short overview of the global picture, and I will look at the UK specific picture in some depth. I'm going to focus a little bit on unmet need. That really anchors the subject, and it helps us think about local services and what we need to be doing very practically on this. There's some other important considerations that aren't covered in the literature currently and things that I've noticed and want people to become aware of. And I will give you a little opportunity. I don't think we'll have time to look at this policy simulation tool, but this is something that I want you to be aware of when Chantal shares the slides, because it could be useful in any work that people are trying to do. Okay. Sorry. Right. So unhelpfully, in some ways, I'm going to start by talking multiple breadbasket failure because that kind of sets the scene, and then I'll move into food security. So unhelpfully, with multiple breadbasket failure, like a lot of these kinds of topics, there are multiple definitions. So All Fed, who I rate pretty highly, they focus very seriously on food and shocks to the food system. They want to use a 5% drop in yield as their measure. Chatham House, an important think tank in the UK, take 10% as their definition. And then the UN, probably one of the most important sources of famine relief globally, use 15%. So you can already see there is this huge range in terms of how we think about this. If we start to think about food security and definitions, it gets even more broad. So recently in a select committee, Dimbleby, who did the UK independent review on food recently, a couple of years ago, he was reflecting on the fact that when you start talking about food security, the range of definitions is even wider. And he characterized that as something between U-boat, what he was prepared to call U-boat, which is a complete self-reliance in the UK for food, ranging from that right over to everyone gets an avocado on Christmas Day. So there's just a kind of, we're nowhere really. And I'll come on and say a little bit more about that, where we are with policy and ministerial lead on that. You'll have to forgive me slightly because I'm working with very strange tech because I'm not at home. I've had to come to London suddenly. So just bear with me 1 sec. I'll just make sure that I'm not missing anything in my notes. That's fine. Okay. Okay. So now I'd like to anchor this a little bit more in food security, so food insecurity, so that we have a sense of the visceral human element of this. Because when we're talking about multiple breadbasket failure, we're of course, you know, it's a very, it's quite a cold term, really cold phrase. And what we're really talking about is people going hungry and people going hungry over time. And we're talking about the potential for high levels of morbidity and mortality globally. So I just want to give you 1 minute to read through. This is from the Food and Agricultural Organization, the UN's body on food, I just want to give you an opportunity to look through some of the questions there during the last 12 months. Are any of these questions applicable to you? Because I think it gives you a sense of human vulnerability. So you can see there that we're not talking about a shortage of peppers, which is where we've got quite a lot of the news coverage recently, and a sort of panic about empty supermarket shelves. But there is complexity here, because as we're talking about climate change, I'm guessing most of the people attending this event are aware that we're talking about a non-start and finish event, where we could be in a situation where we're in stepped decline. And so it becomes much less about calories and more about nutrition. So generally speaking, when policy people and legislators focus on multiple breadbasket failure, they're really talking about starch, they're talking about grains, and they're talking about base calories, how we keep people alive. But if we're talking about this and the intersection of climate change, we do need to think about nutrition and how we remain well in a context of a series of multiple breadbasket failures. Okay, so what are we talking about? When we talk about multiple breadbasket failures, we're talking about breadbaskets and the fact that they are highly concentrated globally. So here you can see the 6 key breadbaskets. And I'll reference a little bit later on that some of these overlap with high climate risk areas. So you can see that we're talking about rice, corn, wheat, and soy. And then this chart is really helping us understand the kind of reliance levels globally. So countries that rely on grain imports, and you can see the tiny wee speck that is our home near the top of that chart, and we're kind of in the middle, really. We're not fabulously self-sufficient, but we're kind of in the mid-range. Okay, so we're talking about these 4 grains, and they make up almost half of the daily calories of the average global diet. And without them, we become hungry quite quickly. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about drivers, risks, and multipliers, because one of the problems, like many other areas of climate change, is that we are not just talking about stresses to the food system from climate. And I think probably in the UK that doesn't need saying, because we've had the Ukrainian conflict influencing what's going on with food in the UK. And of course, we've had Brexit. So we're already starting at an unsatisfactory point, and that's the same globally. So what are we talking about when we talk about the intersection of climate change and yield in food? So we're talking about yield reduction from overheating. So for some grains, corn in particular, the yield drops quite dramatically above a certain temperature. We're talking about a reduction in ability to do outdoor work for agricultural workers, and also potentially damage to farming infrastructure from severe weather events. So I guess I should create the distinction there in case it's not clear. So on one level, we're talking about overheating as we get global temperatures rising. So that's a kind of creeping, slow onset event. And then we're also talking about severe weather events, and they're both acting in some cases at the same time on the food system. Okay, increasing vulnerability to pests and diseases. This is probably something that's familiar to some of you, but we are seeing a much wider range of vectors that are affecting both human health and agriculture. Slow onset changes to nutritional quality. So as global temperatures rise, in some cases, the nutritional quality of plants decreases. In some cases, it rises. So, you know, I normally live in Scotland. You can start producing tomatoes. I'm growing corn now, which is kind of unheard of in Scotland. So, you know, there are some benefits, but they are massively outweighed by the disbenefits of climate change. So we're also talking about severe weather events at home, which I think is kind of obvious from last year, and the drops in yield last year, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. And we're talking about severe weather events abroad. Soil quality and lack of assessment. So I'm going to draw quite heavily over the next 20 minutes on a couple of very important select committees that have happened very recently, specifically the Environmental Audit Committee from the UK government, looking at the intersection of environmental breakdown and food security. And when we look at what they're saying, but also what the CC, the Climate Change Commission, are telling us about food in the UK, there is intense frustration about the fact that we do not have good quality soil assessments. We don't know where we are on this, but we know that we're in pretty bad shape. So I used to live in Norfolk, and if you're moving around Norfolk, you can kind of see the soil disappearing because there are lots of dust eddies taking the topsoil away. We have no idea how much trouble we're in on soil. Biodiversity more broadly, of course, as temperatures change, what we can and can't grow changes. Lack of species diversity. So this is a really interesting one because some of our key crops rely very heavily on one biological or one plant strain. So some people may recall the banana anxieties because we were all relying very heavily on Gros Michel, and that got disease and wiped it out. Not dissimilar, I suppose, to things like the potato famine and the crisis in Ireland, where one single strain, a whole population are relying very heavily on one single strain. Financial speculation and the vagaries of the global trade system. I'm not going to talk about this, but it's absolutely a central element of one of the multipliers. So if we think about what happened with Ukraine, initially, there was no shortage of grain. There was a real difficulty in moving it around, and that was very genuine. But there was also speculation happening, and that changed prices very, very quickly. So what's going on within the financial system is really, really critical in terms of whether people actually get fed and what happens to prices. Cascade effects. So in a sense, I'm already referencing some of those, but this is the way that in the climate change world, we talk about what used to be described as indirect impacts. So with climate change, we talk about, as I'm sure everyone's aware, we talk about things like flood and heat wave and storm events. But of course, there are all sorts of other things that go on at the same time, which influence outcomes for both nature and human beings and the economy. Multiplier effects from wider geopolitics. So I've already referenced Brexit and Ukraine. And there's also the things that are already going on in social policy. So if we think about the UK, one of the important things, and I'll come back and say a little bit more about this in a minute, but it's a personal frustration of mine because I don't feel like the Climate Change Commission have really caught up with the fact that we are not Germany. Austerity has meant that our welfare net, and I'm sure many of you, work in some of these worlds. I work in a food aid system at the weekends, and it's really obvious that the welfare system is not supporting people to meet all of their needs. And that's quite new. This is something that's only gone on in the last sort of 20, 25 years. Okay, I'm going to show you two slides like this. This is a more complex one. The second one has pictures in, it's much easier to grasp. I've added it in here because I want you to have access to it. Chatham House have done some really, really valuable work on mapping different impact areas, and this is their map on food. And I put it up really because it gives you some of the kind of amplifier effects and a kind of rubric of how some of these things feed in. So we're talking about things like rainfall patterns on the left. On your left, you've got things like rainfall patterns, heat waves, changes, wildfires, of course, which was very critical a couple of years ago. I think 2010 was it, when there were fires in Russia. And then you can see as you move across the screen, lots of other things starting to kind of happen as a result of those primary effects. So this one's a little bit simpler, and it was 2010. That's good. I've managed to remember that correctly. So this is really referencing just one event. So some of you will remember there were very severe wildfires in Russia as a result of a drought. And there's mixed evidence on the direct impact that had on food prices, but some people have been happy to say that had an impact on the Middle East and what do I want to say, social conflict in the Middle East. So in some countries, there's an extremely strong relationship between the price of food and the contract between the government and the social square is sometimes based on literally on the price of bread. And so there's a real hair trigger in terms of conflict. So you can see there, you're talking about heat wave, a decline in yield, which actually was a problem over time. It wasn't just about the fires, it was also about air quality. Then there's an export ban. And then some of these other things start to kind of trigger. You get food riots, you get food availability problems, and panic buying, of course, and is financial speculation in their global market, yeah, which I think is critical. Okay, a very short overview of the global picture. So if we look at, so the ECIU is, let me just give you the title of that so that you've got it. This is one of the most important documents. Let me just catch up with my slides. One sec. So the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit have put out a report, and I think it's really, really valuable. Along with the select committees, I think they're really, really important sources of information. And they're talking about an overall productivity drop between 1961 and 2015 of about 21%. So it's really substantial. It's kind of eye-watering. During 2020, 19%, so this is from the Lancet, 19%. So the Lancet, for those that don't know, the Lancet have their own planetary health journal, which is very specifically on health and climate change. It's really, really valuable. And the Lancet do their own work annually on where we are on climate and health. And in 2020, 19% of the Earth was in extreme drought. And that compares with 13% between 1950 and 1999, so a period of relative stasis. Global demand, we will need to produce, in order to keep a step with rises in both expectations about standards of living, but also global population, we will need to produce 50% more food by 2050. And that's before you start to intersect that with some of the stuff that we're doing on mitigation. And I'll come on to say a little bit more about that in a bit, where we are planting lots and lots of trees and taking loads of land out of agricultural use. I'm really sorry, this is not this is not reassuring stuff. I'm sorry, folks. Probability of synchronous crop failure is at the moment it would be surprising. It's a very, very small percentage chance that we will have a multiple breadbasket failure that will see a genuine shortage of food at this point. But you can see that climbs pretty quickly as we move into the subsequent decades. Right, storage. From a policy point of view, food storage is one of the most important things, most important bits of kit in the bag. Our ability to store food nationally is one of the ways in which we control flow of food. So stock to use ratios is the way that this is described. And it would be ideal if they were 35 to 40%, and currently we're at about 30%. The trade system. I'm not going to talk about the trade system, but it's really, really important. It's referenced very heavily in one of the select committees, and some of the stuff that went on post-Brexit in terms of the UK and the extraordinarily poor trade agreements that were developed in haste as a result of Brexit have left us in more of a pickle than we need to be. Okay. UK specific picture. Okay, I'm going to try and really speed up, but we can come back to any of this in the questions. So in the same way, we've got a multitude of possible impacts. We've got heat and water stress, which is some of what we saw last year. We've got soil erosion from rain and wind, which I talked about earlier, and we've got crop disease. In the UK, the historical context is important. So in post-Second World War, there were lots of stresses around food security. It was a real issue during the Second World War. And so for a huge amount of time, for decades, there was a high degree of consensus about domestic production. And that has disappeared now, partly as a result of, decades of conflict and complacency on the issue. Heat wave yield drop. So wheat production decreases by about 40%. Sorry, wheat production decreased by about 40% from 16.2 tonnes in 2019 to 9.7 tonnes in 2020. This is DEFRA data in response to drought stresses. Right, so select committee stuff. I can't, if you want to go deep on this, I don't think I can overestimate the importance of the EAC committee oral evidence sessions. They're really useful. There's a really wide range of policy specialists. We're already starting behind. So because of the Ukrainian conflict and to some extent because of Brexit and climate change, we're in a situation where in 2022 versus 2019, we produced 1 billion less eggs. Now that's the other thing that's feeding into that is welfare, animal welfare changes, which have seen quite a lot of people leave egg production. But for the first time, I think in 2021, we were importing eggs from Italy, or no, maybe that was last year actually. We were importing eggs from Italy. This is nearly unheard of. We've generally been self-sufficient. And some of you may remember some controls and rationing going on with eggs. It was certainly a thing in Scotland. We're on the lowest tomato and cucumber yields since 1985, and that's very directly related to Ukraine and the energy crisis. Soil quality I've mentioned. Right, so this is important. Implicit in the 6th carbon budget and reaching net zero is a 10% increase in agricultural productivity to accommodate some of the sequestration planting that we endeavour to do. That increase in productivity and yield is not there. That is not in evidence at the moment, and the CCC have made that very clear. Severe weather events across Europe in 2016-17 led to really quite serious hikes in some imported veg. This is astonishing to me. I didn't know this, even though I've worked on climate change for 20 years. The national adaptation plans do not include overseas impacts. And so when we think about food, we are working slightly blind, I would argue, because we import about 40% of our food. Food inflation, okay, so this is up to date as of today, I think, is at 17.2%. It's down from where it has been, but it's still incredibly high. Right, the UK government at the moment is very comfortable with the idea that it will not have a definition of food security. This is a problem for policymakers, and it's even a problem for Minette Batters at the NFU. And I think if the government is trailing behind the NFU, then we are in quite a lot of problems, because usually the NFU is quite a conservative organisation. And many of us will remember, so this is just some of the kind of stuff that has gone on historically in the UK. We will remember during COVID, supermarkets were price gouging and their profits went up by a staggering 97%. That's just the big three. But nevertheless, it's shocking, I would argue. Okay, this slide is just giving you a sense. It's a little bit of a confusing slide because it's got lots of pinks and purples on it. But what I'd like you to do is look at the top purple, which is food and non-alcoholic beverages. And it just gives you a sense of the growing significance of food inflation. And of course, the other big purple job is housing, unsurprisingly. So that just gives you a sense of a growing picture. But also then we need to bear in mind that we are smoothed compared to other countries. So if we look at Egypt, food inflation is about 60%. So it's tricky, it's really tricky. And people at the bottom of the income scale are already in quite a mess. But we are a long way ahead of a lot of countries. So some of you may remember some of these news stories. One of the problems that we have in this country is that we have multiple problems in the food system. One is that we're having a lot of retirement from the food system. There's a lot of farmers' children that do not want to carry on doing what their parents have been doing. It's a huge problem with retirement out of the farming and agricultural sector. We have serious problems with agricultural workers because of Brexit. And we have, as a result of some of these things and some of the drought problems last year, we have quite a lot of people not growing. And that's coupled with other geopolitical issues like Ukraine, which is down, I think, 30 to 40% on its planting for this year, this season. This was a story from a couple of days ago, no, about a month ago, more fruit and veg shortages to come as weather in UK and Spain hits crops. And this is the NFU saying this. So they're already bracing us for problems. Right, this was the slide. Sorry, I got the order slightly wrong, but this was the slide I was hoping to show you. So this gives you some sense of, although commodity prices and food prices in the UK are changing very quickly and they're going up, you can see that compared to global commodity prices, we are comfortable. And of course, that's a problem. If you understand social justice, then that's not a comfortable graph, because rich countries always get fed. Poor people within rich countries don't necessarily get fed, which is kind of what we're seeing now. Okay, we're not going to look at this now because we don't have time, but for any of you who are wanting to do work with local authorities or other teams that you might be working with, this is a really nice tool that was developed during COP26 and then updated in COP27. And it kind of takes people through the global issues in a way that's much easier to listen to than somebody like me rabbiting on. And we'll share that with you. Okay, this is a really, really important issue. I want to move from thinking about global geopolitical ways of moving food around and just think about the UK and unmet need. So if you don't work on food and you don't work on social policy, it may not be clear to you just how many people are hungry. We don't have a massive focus on it, but we all know that food banks are around and they weren't in the past, and many of us will know that they weren't in the past. So before the pandemic, which was definitely a dry run food crisis in terms of climate change, I think it taught us a lot. 43% of those on universal credit were already food insecure, and that's DWP figures, and we can assume that's as an underestimation. So I need to say something about food banks just here, because if you don't know about this issue, then it's really important to separate out Trussell Trust, who are providers of food banks for about half of the food banks in the UK, from all of the other food banks, the independent ones. And so it's important to use IFAN data rather than Trussell Trust data. And I'm afraid the CCC, the Climate Change Commission, and British journalists fall into this trap every time. They talk about Trussell Trust and they are only seeing half of the picture. Let's skip forward. 95% of independent food banks saw a hike in response to the UC cut. So people may recall that after the pandemic had finished, the uptick in universal credit payments, which I think was about £10, was cut. And immediately there's this response into, so this just shows you just how near the edge a lot of UK families are. What else do I want to pull out from this? 75% of independent food banks have been impacted by supply issues before winter 2023, i.e. the Ukraine crisis. So I'm just going to tip into my own experience at this point. So I've worked at what we call a mutual aid food aid system for about 3 years. And the calorie offer from then to now has at least halved because of the cost of food, particularly oil. We're working in a really Pakistani area of the city, and this is a community that really need oil in order to be able to cook, and we are not providing it, and we were at the beginning. So this is a hidden part of the system. We hear a lot about food banks, but they are not. There's no way that we're handing over what a family needs for a week. I mean, no way. Don't need to talk about any more of that. Food Foundation, 11 rounds of data collection. So this is really valuable stuff, because they've done lots and lots of in-depth looks at what's going on. 80% of household adults report skipping meals or worse, and those levels doubled over 2022. Talked about that local example. No UK measure of unmet need at local level. So this was really surprising during the pandemic. I worked as a logistics person on food aid, and it was astonishing to me that local authorities did not have lists of vulnerable people. So we had no sense. We were giving out huge amounts of food, but we had no sense of whether that was, what percentage that was of meeting need. We were working blind. Okay, so there's some of what we do know, and here's some of what is not clear, or things that it's worth thinking about. Pre-existing food insecurity. So my line on multiple breadbasket failure and climate change is that multiple breadbasket failure is sufficient, but not necessary. We are already in a food crisis, and multiple breadbasket failure would compound that for populations around the world, but to some extent for us. But actually, we've already got very serious food problems, and that's also reflected in what the UN is saying globally. We're starting at the wrong point when we're entering climate impacts. So we're already in pre-existing food insecurity before we see serious climate impacts in the UK. Get on the wagon. So what do I mean by this? Well, I live in Scotland. Scotland, quite a lot of the grain that's grown in Scotland is going into alcohol, and that's for economic purposes. It's mostly for trade. It's not, I mean, a lot of it's being consumed in Glasgow, don't misunderstand me, but most of it's for trade. It's going to places like Japan. Now, in a serious crisis, we could, of course, pivot out of that, not very quickly, but we could pivot out of that to start using that grain for food. But it's substantial. I think it's about a third. Soil health, I've talked about. That's a really, really important compounding factor, which we're working blind on. Maladaptation, creating food insecurity abroad. So I don't know whether people have heard this phrase before, but this is this is a really, really important consideration in policy, because some of the things that we do, which we think are helping other countries and ourselves to adapt to climate change, are maladaptive, and they are creating problems elsewhere. Martin Sen's famine theory. So he saw a very close relationship. He would argue that it's not really about a shortage of food, it's about poverty. And so that's worth bearing in mind, because that's kind of where we are now in the UK. We don't really have a shortage of food, but we have a huge amount of people unable to afford to eat. Export restrictions. Okay, so that's a really important thing. What we should see as soon as a yield drops within a country is that they should stop exporting and feed their own population. Now, of course, for all sorts of economic, geopolitical reasons, that doesn't happen, but there's no reason to say that it wouldn't happen, and it has happened in the past. Policy amenable versus political traction. So this is a really important distinction in terms of the way in which good or bad things happen within policy and legislation. So there are things that we can see what might be done, but if we are making the assumption that hungry people will compel legislators to bring about change that makes sure that everyone gets fed, we are being naive. And so there's some of what could work, and then there's some of what's politically sellable. We're not just talking about starch, we're talking about how we stay healthy in the context of climate impacts. England versus the devolves. This is an important consideration, because we're really, when we talk about food insecurity within nations, it's England that's the red spot. So Scotland has quite a small population and a lot of land mass, and it's similar for the other devolved administrations. England has a huge population, and from a policy point of view, they're slightly behind the other nations. Storage and redundancy. This is complicated because storage is one of the main tools that you can use to smooth supply, but it's a difficult thing. It's expensive, it's difficult to get political support for. It's not unlike the pandemic in the sense that, you know, we had pandemic plans and we'd had a huge amount of storage of things like PPE decades before the pandemic, but it turns out that it wasn't there when we needed it. And this is part of what happens in terms of storage. It's quite hard to get political support for. And of course, in other countries, it can be mired in complexity to do with things like corruption. If people, I mean, it's described as corruption, but I don't think that's fair. I think if workers are hungry, then food will disappear. And I think that's probably legitimate. Net zero fears. Okay. When you look at the data, and I'm just going to get the statistic for you because it's fabulous. Just bear with me one sec, folks. We're nearly at our end. Let me just get this data for you. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to find it now because I'm too far through my notes. Yeah, I'll find it for you while we're doing the questions, because it's really brilliant. But essentially, it's looking at the relationship between climate agreements, the NDCs, the national determined contributions, and what countries have committed to in terms of mitigation, and what that means in terms of land use, and what we already use. And it's a staggering amount of global land that has been committed for carbon sequestration, i.e. planting trees to take to mitigate carbon emissions and to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. So we sort of need that land for food growing, or we need to do something really serious on efficiency and yield. Okay, so that's, I don't know, I wasn't actually paying too much attention to time. Where are we now? I can't see.
It's 8:15, Rebecca.
Yeah, okay. So that's it from me, but I'm really happy to take questions. So some analysis done by the University of Melbourne found that 1.2 billion hectares of land had been committed within country state commitments on tree planting or other mitigatory endeavours. And that's contrasted with 5 billion hectares of land used currently to grow food globally. So 5 billion hectares is used globally to grow food. And as a result of our mitigation efforts globally through COP, and this is COP27, 1.2 billion hectares of land has been committed for tree planting. So you can see already that that's just a clash that's not going to work. We're going to need to come up with some clever plans to sort it out.
Yeah, except I wouldn't worry about that, Rebecca, because at the risk of sounding cynical, countries don't follow through on.
No, and I'd actually put that note in. Should we get any delivery on climate plans? Yeah, maybe we don't need to fret about that one.
Great, okay. Oh, someone's coming in. All right, so let's just open it up for some initial questions. Do you have any burning questions that you'd love to ask Rebecca? Because obviously there's a lot of information there, which is brilliant, but you might want to delve into something specific. So if you do, can you just unmute yourself, please, and feel free to ask the question. Michael's hand is raised. So Michael, do you want to unmute and ask a question, please?
Is that me, Michael's iPad?
Yes, it is. Oh, who's that?
Sorry, I've been trying to change the name and it won't change back. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you. That was really, really fascinating. I'd like to ask you if you have any thoughts on plant-based versus meat, if they're, you know, if that is as important an issue as we are thinking it is.
Well done for raising it. Yeah, it's absolutely critical. Even just modest amounts of reduction in meat consumption make quite a difference in terms of land use. One of the problems that we have got is the alternatives to meat are complex, and in the select committee we learnt from Dimbleby, who's this kind of big figure in food in the UK, that it doesn't look like meat, kind of synthetic meats produced in labs are going to be cost efficient. So that is talked about quite a lot in the media as this solution, but it doesn't look like it's going to be a credible solution. So we're then looking at protein alternatives that are plant-based, and the reduction in land use, as many people will know, is dramatic. And if you think about this in a way, if you think about the meat on your plate, and if you were to try and put the amount of grain that sits behind that meat on your plate, I mean, it's unimaginable. It's covering the table. So that gives you some sense of why that just won't work in terms of the amount of land use.
We've got a question, and then Jeremy's got his hand up, and we've also got a question here, which actually I also had the same questions. Let's get this question from Susan first, and then Jeremy after that. Susan asks, could you give an example of maladaptation creating food insecurity? Also, what is non-interventionism?
Ah, right, okay. I'm going to do the second one first because I need to think about the first one. Non-interventionism. So the reason that's there is because when you follow the various select committees, the hearings, we heard from the minister who has responsibility for food security, Spencer, and he is incredibly relaxed about not intervening. And that makes us a basket case globally, because most states, regardless of their political complexion, are happy to intervene when it's about food. And I'll give you an example of that. So Minette Batters, who's the head of the NFU, she's a big figure within the food world, during her oral evidence giving, explained something that I didn't know, which is that if you're in the United States, which is no socialist paradise in terms of the way that people are looked after, you can be the equivalent of Minette Batters in the NFU in the States, can be in meetings about food pricing, but that is not possible in the UK. There is a very sharp distinction between the people who work on market intervention and people who work in the food system. And even in the States, there is a higher degree of political and policy intervention on food and food pricing than there is in the UK. So we are quite a long way behind even the kind of unusually laggard countries in terms of food security. So the simple thing is that the government do not want to intervene. So when the minister was asked, can you describe what food insecurity is, and are you happy to put a target on it? He was happy to say, yeah, it's not really going to work. You're going to have perverse outcomes from creating a target. So they just want to leave a kind of laissez-faire market system in terms of how the food system runs. And that, I don't think that's going to serve us well. Maladaptation. So an example would be, I'm thinking slightly off the top of my head now, an example would be when we try to, we might create a system where we want to change the kind of food, we want to change the standards of production of food in order to accommodate climate targets, let's say, that may create perverse outcomes in somewhere like Morocco in terms of energy use. Let me think of another clearer example. I can't think of one at the moment. Can I come back to that question?
Rebecca, can I just ask a question on that? If we had to drastically think about changing our diet or had to introduce a different food group because of what's happening, that potentially also have all kinds of unpredictable right now implications.
Yeah, that's a much better example, actually. So if we were to make restrictions on, say, food that generally is traded, i.e. that we import, that could have implications for the economy of small countries. Morocco is a really good example, actually, because we get quite a lot of our organic veg and veg generally from southern Spain and Morocco, as many of you will realise. So yeah, that's a really, really good example.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy's had his hand up. Jeremy, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for your presentation, Rebecca. I think you referred to, so the Chatham House report said just under 50% chance of synchronous crop failure of the order they described during the 2040s. Have you got a ballpark figure of that probability for as soon as the 2030s, or even like the end of this decade of El Nino?
It is in the report. I can't bring it to mind just now, but I'm going to share the sources with you. So you could look that up yourself, but it kind of grades, and then it's at the 2040 point where it really starts to go off a cliff and it tips into the 50%. Okay,
and is it, from what you remember, is it still a big concern or a small concern, if you had to like sum up in a few words? Because I know the numbers can be difficult. I can't remember the figure, I'm really sorry, but it's a big step up from the 2020s. So you're getting these really increased grades up. Oh, I see, yeah. So 2030 is much higher risk than this decade. Yeah. Exactly that. Okay, thank you. I mean, I should say with Chatham House that I would say that Chatham House, although they've done really valuable work, still run to a fairly
I think for this audience, a fairly conservative way of understanding immediate climate risk. So it's possible that their work is underestimating the scale of the problem. Certainly when we look at as I said, with the Climate Change Commission, they are already underestimating what's going on at the bottom of the income scale. So there will be other things that won't be considered by something like Chatham House. So I would consider their numbers conservative.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Could I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think there's a lot subsumed within some of the wording, but this Chatham House, study, did it actually reference the high potential for the loss of productive land due to flooding? I mean, if you look at the DEFRA website and look at Lincolnshire and Norfolk by 2050, a lot of it isn't going to be there. And within 70 years, if it's true, and God help us that it isn't true, but I'm sure it is, England, Britain is going to have quite a different shape.
Yeah.
So in terms of,
doesn't it?
It is. It's really scary. I mean, it scares me more than anything else, because no matter what, I rephrase that, it would take considerable adaptation to counteract such a loss of land. And we will always be importing our food, it seems to me, on an ever greater scale. And I just wondered if they actually referenced that within their studies, because the slides you showed us, which were great, it didn't mention flooding once, nor did it mention intense rainfalls, which we can now expect with our climate change. But I accept that that was probably within, the intense rainfall was probably within the slides as a the climate risk, but the flooding one is huge.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, I think that's a really valid question. My absolute assumption is that flooding would definitely be in their analysis, because the team are working on direct and indirect impacts, and flooding is such an important feed into that. But it's interesting it's not mentioned there. The thing that comes to mind from your question is, about 5 years ago now, I made a habit of listening to Farming Today, which is a Radio 4 programme that happens in the morning for it's like 15 minutes long. And it really gives you the inside dope, actually, on what's going on in the food sector. And over the winter, we had quite a lot of flooding, and there was an enormous amount of crops that were underwater. I mean, it was absolutely staggering. And it didn't seem to be reflected in the national news. No. And I was really struck by this. So I think your question is a legitimate one, and I don't know the answer, but I know that they will have flooding in their sites. But it's interesting how that doesn't make it into the kind of national news. So we're always working slightly blind on the picture that we're being given.
Sorry to go on about it, but it's not just the lost land, which is horrendous, but in the intervening years, the soil is becoming salinated, and it's really hard to remove the salt, so nothing grows in salt apart from under the water. So that really scares me.
Point. Yeah, really it's a really pertinent point. And actually, we're losing some crops without even having flooding. I mean, in parts of Scotland, there are real issues with salt water being splashed onto growing areas and agricultural land. Gosh. And as you say, the yield is reduced as a result, and it can be hard to use that soil for a long time afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kathy. Rebecca, we've got 30 minutes left. What we'd like to do is have a bit of time in smaller groups to just have a bit of a moment to reflect. I've got a couple of questions which I'm going to put into the chat box, everyone. We're just going to have 10-15 minutes in smaller groups of about 4. And the questions are, what are your sort of initial reflections and feelings about what you've just heard? And also, what do you think the focus should be, your focus or the wider focus should be, in terms of local community preparedness, resilience, and adapting for food shocks? Because clearly, we just heard that we've got no major interventions at the moment. We're not really properly measuring food insecurity. It just, to me, means that there's even more, it's even more important that we think about local community resilience. So we'd love to just, if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to just organise some breakout rooms. If you could just take those questions with you into the breakout rooms and just have a reflection and a discussion about that, then we'll come back together and just hear people's thoughts. Yeah, okay, I'm going to do that now. Let's do.
What I should have said is that, of course, we're not talking about necessarily no one eating any meat at all because of hillside farming. So if you look at quite large tracts of Wales, where you can grow sheep on a hillside, but you can't really grow other crops in any kind of meaningful way, then we're probably still talking about a little bit of meat, but it is a dramatic reduction from where we are now. And no one, even people who are quite content with meat eating as a way forward, sees us being able to care for the environment and eat the levels of meat that we do now. No one thinks that's viable.
Thank you.
Can I just ask everyone to mute themselves for a second? Rebecca, do you know you're in the dark?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I've had to come to a funeral in London, so I'm hiding in an attic. So I'm really sorry. If I open the windows, you won't be able to see me at all. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Maybe I'll put a wee lamp on, actually. Let me see if I can put a lamp on, because it's a bit weird. It looks like I'm in a cave. Let's see if I can put one of these.
That's fine. While you're doing that, this is just an opportunity now, the sort of last 15 minutes of the session, to share any questions that have maybe arisen for you when you've been reflecting with everybody else. So any questions that are coming up for you, and just any other reflections, just share a bit about what you talked about in your smaller groups, so we can all hear the wisdom of everybody else.
It's really interesting to hear from anyone who's working in a food setting as well, whether they've got any stories or thoughts or reflections on their own work situation. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, so I'm going to mute myself, but if you'd like to unmute yourself, if you have why don't we start with any questions that came up from your discussions that you'd like to ask Rebecca, or just the group?
We understand the issue, the problem, and I think I don't know the lady's name who talked about the flooding and how much smaller the UK is going to get in years to come. But I just suppose it's difficult to know quite what to do. So we know the problem, we know the magnitude of the problem, but it's just what should we be doing?
Does anyone want to respond to that? I have thoughts about what's going on in my city, but I'd be really interested to hear.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was in a breakout room with Anna, so these are from Anna rather than myself, but I thought they were very good and worth sharing, things that have happened in Hampshire, where she's based, that the district council there funded 50% of the cost of a fruit tree, that those people who wanted to have a fruit tree in their garden, and everyone was encouraged in the community to have a fruit tree in their garden, but to share the fruit, that it was a sort of community-based thing, not just that you got, you know, so there was a variety of fruit in various gardens. And it felt to me like that was something great that would, you know, try to encourage the council to do more, to be seen to be doing things and building sort of community sharing of food. And I think there was another one about putting fruit trees, you know, planting fruit trees on streets, then lining streets with fruit trees.
Can you speak up for nuts, Dave? So you're down south and you guys can grow walnuts, but over the whole of the country we can all grow hazelnuts, and there's going to be a protein shortage, I feel. And so I really want to speak up for, if anyone's involved in any fruit tree planting, to get some nuts in the mix. That would be really great.
Excuse the pun.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Anybody else would like to share a question or reflections, ideas?
Anna, come in.
We also talked about community supported agriculture schemes, and how important they will be going forward. They're often on established bits of farmland or a pocket of it, or they are moving to a bit of a spare field, something like that. You only need a few acres to start on. Shag food is probably the best model, and easy to see on YouTube. Personally, I think every golf course should be compulsorily purchased and given over to allotment holders. These things, this is one of the changes that's going to happen now. Complete waste of time and land. Nobody's going to be able to have time to play golf going forward. So let's just take those back. Plus, they use water that we need. So allotments and community supported agriculture schemes, and putting pressure on our local councils and laying these ideas before them. We talked about the fact that our district councils and county councils and town councils to a degree will be very surprised when the central government at some point says, oh, actually, this is going to be your responsibility. Because they're not prepared. Believe me, they are not prepared. They're not prepared for migration coming up from inland from the coasts. They're not prepared at all. I've been to 2 or 3 resilience events recently run by our district council, and they were about emergency responses to flooding and about nature and electricity, which is all good stuff, but that food just wasn't mentioned because it doesn't come up on their remit now. So they think it's never going to be their responsibility, and that's going to change, obviously.
So to encourage you, Anna, in Glasgow, we are slowly, there are plans to turn Ruckhill Golf Course into a site for land for food production. So it's a very slow process because it's working with the council, but it is underway. So that's heartening.
That's great. Can we go with Mr. Trump's golf course next?
Yeah.
That would be good.
I was thinking the same. Yeah.
Could I ask?
Can I just hang on, Kathy? Sorry, Jeremy's got his hand up. So can we just?
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon.
Okay, it's all right.
I've got my hand up as well. I think it was.
Okay, right. Well, let's go to Jeremy first, and then Kathy and Neela. We've got time.
You sure that's all right? Yeah,
that's fine. And before you speak, I just want to say one thing, which is golf course is great. I think we've also got a lot of wasted allotments. Like people have got allotments and they're not using them anyway. Jeremy.
Yeah. I've done quite a bit of reading on like the psychology of climate change and how people imagine it, and as you're probably aware, a lot of people find it quite difficult to imagine how things could be in the distant future, or if people hear about stats of 2100 or 2050 or 2040, sometimes that people think, oh, I don't need to worry about that. That's even if they have children, for a lot of people, they're more worried about the paycheck at the end of the month to just be able to pay the grocery bills. So that's why I'm kind of really keen to know a bit more about the near term. So because you might know like Jem Bendel, who started the deep adaptation movement. So he said that if we have this super El Nino and it causes 1.5 to be exceeded temporarily in next year, then he according to him, it's probable that international supplies of maize will fall by 2027. And I don't know what to do with that and what to do with it intellectually and emotionally, and is he overstating it or not?
I could just come back on that. So yeah, Jem's done some really interesting work on food. I decided not to use it because he's not a food specialist. Work's really good, but I decided to focus very specifically on food analysts and food specialists, so that I could be really confident about the data. But yeah, I would.
Yeah.
I think it's worth a read.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
And just on that, I would recommend, if anybody's just came out last week, his latest book, Breaking Together, is very dense, but well worth a read. And yeah, and he's certainly what he has been since 2018, talking about things that are far more imminent than most of the mainstream are. And that's why community resilience is so important: psychological, emotional, spiritual. So yeah, there's lots of practical things that we can do in our communities, but it's also about not shutting our eyes and facing it together.
I guess people are aware of the Climate Psychology Alliance. Jeremy, Jeremy, you might find that interesting if you're.
Yeah, I think Caroline Hickman, is she part of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd really recommend them. Yeah.
Right, thank you. So, Kathy, Kathy, you had your hand up, and Neela as well. Would you like to ask or share anything, please? Kathy?
Oh, sorry, I didn't know who. I'm being a bit cynical, I'm afraid. My elderly parents, who no longer here, but they grew, they were in the war days, and dig for Britain,
yeah,
and everything that could be dug was dug, including golf courses. And we would have starved as a nation without the North Atlantic food arrivals from America. We could not produce enough food then, and food then we would regard as sort of British staples like swedes and turnips and wheat and potatoes and things and cabbages or whatever. We wouldn't have the diversity of food that we're used to in our generation. So I just wondered whether any of the studies that have referenced that, in terms of do we know how much acreage, I don't know, was under the plough, under the every cottage garden, every garden that was growing potatoes for the war effort, as opposed to what land is now available, and with the efficiency that if you go into non-organic farming, the mechanization of the farming system that we have now, are we now producing more food than we were then? Or are we producing less because we import more?
So there's loads of things I could come back on there. I don't have the data for Dig for Victory, but it was a very successful policy initiative. And it does two things at once, of course, because it unites everyone in a common endeavour, but also does mean that food is produced really, really near to where it's consumed, and it increases overall production across the country. What I was going to just say about post-Second World War is that people may be aware of something called the Green Revolution, which wasn't green, but it was about a massive increase in yield as a result of technological approaches, but mostly the use of fertilizers and pesticides.
Yeah, exactly, the bad things.
Yeah, so that was a massive increase in yield, but a huge step backwards in terms of soil quality and environmental protection.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We do have to bring it to a close in a couple of minutes, but Neela, I know that you, if I'm pronouncing
just quickly, most has been said already. Just to add to this about using the council spaces to grow things in a way more as a food forest, permaculture, so to keep that biodiversity and not just take from the ground, so add to the ground while we grow in, so there's ways to do it. I think that would be good. And just getting used to more sharing and swapping skills and resources and food and all those kind of things, working together as communities. I think that's really important to keep kind of community sufficiency rather than self-sufficiency. and obviously and resilience as well. Yeah, so I think that would be good ways forward. Yeah, and thank you for tonight, really.
Just to come back on that, Neela, really quickly. So my understanding from the people that I work with who do really good work with the local authority on food production in public spaces, there's two things to say. In England, some of you will be aware of Incredible Edible going on in Todmorden, and the leader of that has done some work with the UK government on the right to grow on public land. It remains to be seen what happens with that, but I think it's a private day members bill at the moment. In Scotland, our experience, and particularly in the city of Glasgow, has been that it is incredibly difficult to get public support for growing in parks. People are incredibly defensive of parks as spaces that are not utilised for food growing. Some of that's starting to change, but it's a really difficult issue. It takes a lot of time and community engagement to get shifts on that.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I think if people were noticing a real struggle with food and lack of food, I think that resistance would go out the window. But also, it's not about.
I think it's about who does activism in parks and who's hungry. And I think Friends of Parks aren't usually the hungry folk, but I'm making an assumption there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm conscious that it's 9 o'clock and I don't want to steal any more of your valuable time. Certainly my takeaway again, excuse the pun, is definitely that we need to, think about our local resilience and growing, but also I do think we have to work even more closely with our local councils and councillors to come up with innovative ideas and creative ideas together to work in partnership, which is very much what Heart Community Group has been trying to do, work in partnership. I know Cadence RoundTable, the same thing. Lots of food for thought. I just can't stop the puns. I can't stop. Lots of food for thought here. Thank you so much, Rebecca.